You're good to go. I think we're ready on this end line.
Okay, we're ready. You can hear us?
I can hear you great.
Okay, good evening. Good evening from Washington, D.C. This looks like a cabinet meeting here. We have the Secretaries of State and Defense and the Interior here. The 7 students that are assembled, 3 here with me in Washington, and 4 there on the Cronkite stage with Brandon Quester, are 7 of the 8 Cronkite students who are part of the News21 project this year on voting rights. A very, very successful project that I think has helped drive coverage about this issue throughout the country. Stories produced by the News21 project have appeared in many newspapers across the country, many websites across the country, including the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, NBC.com, on which there were 7 million page views for the 20 stories from the project. It appeared on NBCnews.com over a month's period. And NPR, which broadcast one of the stories from the News21 project just a few weeks ago, has had a big impact around the country. I'm going to talk a little bit about the project generally at the beginning, and then I'm going to have individual students talk about their parts of it. And just so they can get ready, we'll probably start with Corbin Carson and Natasha Khan to talk about the election fraud database and story. And then Kara Prasad here at Phoenix to talk about the Washington Post poll on voter ID and about the voter ID issue. And then Joe Henke here in Washington to talk about the Secretaries of State story that he did about the politicization of the Secretaries of State who are running the elections tomorrow night in the state, in many of the states around the Union. And then A.J. Vicens and Natasha Khan to talk about the poll watchers who could make very big news tomorrow night around the country if they start having fist fights with each other, taking each other to court and so on, and polling places around the country. Jack Fitzpatrick to talk about college students and how the voter ID laws voting rights for felons after they've completed their sentences and paid their debt to society. And finally, Brandon Quester to talk about multimedia, which is a very important part of the project. We're trying to innovate in various ways in multimedia, from databases to interactive things of various kinds, and photo galleries and videos. So I'll start a little bit about describing what News21 is for those of you who don't know it. It is financed by the Carnegie Corporation and the Knight Foundation and a number of universities, including Arizona State. This is the 3rd year that we have had a national News21 investigative reporting project, and we have a grant that will continue it for at least another decade. Eligible for it are graduate students and exceptional undergraduates at Cronkite and at universities all around the country. So for this year, and our first project was about transportation safety 3 years ago. Last year it was about food safety, and this year was about voting rights. We had 24 students involved in the project this year, 8 from Cronkite, the rest from 10 universities around the country. So in effect, we had 11 national bureaus for this project, which virtually hardly any news organizations can have any longer around the country. And we started with a spring semester seminar that I taught along with Bill Merrimaw, who at that time was the executive editor of News21 before he went back to the Philadelphia Inquirer to become their executive editor. And during the seminar, we did the research and beginning reporting on the subject to sort out what topics do we want to cover. We decided we wanted to cover the whole issue of election fraud versus voter ID, which we'll be discussing tonight. Things like early voting in some parts of the country, particularly in the western United States. The question of whether or not voter ID discriminates against the voters of color and students and the elderly, people who do not have the kind of state-issued ID regularly that was being required by some of these states. Whether or not there was an organized effort by Republican legislators around the country to pass these voter ID laws in order to hold down what they thought would be a Democratic voters. The advent of poll watchers, starting on the conservative side, now being matched up by those on the liberal side in various polling places around the country. Again, disproportionately polling places where voters of color are voting. The question whether or not they're trying to intimidate them from the right, and whether the left is trying to deal with that, and so on. But what turned out to be one of the centerpieces of the project was something nobody else had done before. There are all these arguments going on: is there voter fraud or is there not voter fraud? Is it a problem? Is it not a problem? Does it require voter ID laws or not? And so we set out to do something very ambitious, which was to find out how much election fraud there is in the United States. Nobody else had done that before. There had been attempts at it, but mostly by partisan groups like the Republican National Lawyers Association, which essentially just collected newspaper clippings online. So we organized our team of reporters under the leadership of Corbin Carson, working with Steve Doig on the faculty, a Pulitzer Prize-winning database journalist, to query every one of the 50 states, filing freedom of information requests if necessary, calling state officials, calling down at the county level when necessary, in order to assemble all this information and then analyze it, and came up with a database that you can find on the website. You have that particular part of the website up, Brandon? You can show people that while we talk. Stay alert, Brandon, will you please? Brandon, by the way, was the teaching assistant for the seminar, and then we assembled in the summer to actually produce all the journalism, brought all the national journalists into Cronkite, all 24 journalists from the newsroom there, and Brandon was our management leader, our multimedia leader, and handled a lot of other management of the project. Did just amazing, amazing work. And he's now started something called the Arizona Center for Investigative Reporting that I promised him I would plug tonight, and he wants people to contribute to it and to work for him, probably for free, so do whatever you can for Brandon. So, it's informal here tonight. So I've had Corbin can first talk about how the database was done and analyzed, and then Natasha Khan was the co-author of the story, and she will talk about how that analysis was used in putting the story together and the kinds of reactions that she got from people on both sides of the issue about our findings. Corbin?
Thank you, Lynn. Good evening, everyone. So, like Lynn said, as part of the News21 investigation into voting rights, what we wanted to do was tackle the issue of voter fraud. Try to figure out if it was affecting elections. First of all, if there really was any voter fraud, if it was affecting elections, and if the new voter ID laws would prevent or potentially could prevent that voter fraud. And we started back in January during the seminar. We started talking to experts, election experts, and election officials across the country, trying to figure out this is a huge issue. And so one of the first things we started realizing is that there was a terminology issue. There was a wide array of election crimes that were being touted, I guess you could say, as voter fraud. So we, working with, like Lynn said, a large team, we started dissecting the election crimes into different categories, which you can see up there, and then trying to figure out a way that we could get all that data from everyone. Anyway. So the first thing we realized is that, or the first thing we did back in March is we sent out public records requests to each of the 50 secretaries of state, and then at times from there we had to go to the 50 attorney generals, and then from there we started having to go county by county, and our request was simple. We were asking for any information about election fraud crimes since 2000, and the public records request system is a story all in of itself, but Lynn asked us to speak succinctly, so I won't go into that. Just know that it was a fiasco. Just real quick, we were getting stuff from Podunk County in Arkansas with like a coffee stain, and they're returning our fax, and it just says no fraud. So issues like that was what we were dealing with. But anyway, as our team grew, our team grew because the amount of documents that started piling in from all across the country grew. I mean, I think we were up to somewhere near 5,000 documents that we ended up going through. That included responses from election officials, that included court cases, etc. So, as we got all that, and here's a look at the document cloud site, which is part of the database. And what's cool about this is really full disclosure. So for any naysayer that's, were to look into our data, here it is. Here's every response from every county and every case. It's a searchable database, and you can find that coffee-stained response from someone if you were so inclined. Anyway, so we went through all of that, and the end result was 2,068 cases of election crimes. Of that, there were 10 reported cases of voter impersonation fraud, which is the only type of fraud that could potentially be stopped by voter ID laws, which means you walk into a polling station and you say, here's my ID, I'm Lynn Downey, even though I'm Corbin Carson, and you try to vote for someone else. And we found 10 cases of that since 2000. And I think what that represents, one of the findings we found is over hundreds of millions of votes cast during that time. I think it represents 1 in 15 million that had happened during that time. So I probably missed a lot, but I'll let Natasha go ahead and jump in from what I missed there.
Natasha, obviously this was a potentially very controversial story. It has been cited many, many times on television programs, and just was cited again today in the Washington Post. And as a result, people on both sides of the issue wanted to either make hay with it or oppose it. And therefore, it was a very difficult and important story to write, given the impact it was going to have. So tell us how you did that.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone. Once we had the data, it was pretty clear what we found. Like Corbin and Lynn said, we found very, very little voter impersonation fraud, which is the reason state legislatures were saying was the cause of these voter ID bills. So I was tasked with taking what we found and trying to find experts on the issue that didn't have a stake in either side of the debate. So I took it to what we found, and I think the two main things that we found in the data was, of course, the very small amount of voter impersonation fraud, and then the fact that the most fraud that we found, the most common type of fraud, was absentee ballot fraud, and that is being increasingly used more in this country, and there have been very few laws passed regulating that system. So election experts that I interviewed, they said, yes, we've been essentially, basing our assertions of the fact that there is very little voter impersonation fraud on, a few reports that have been done. No one had ever compiled election fraud to this extent. So we really appreciate what you're doing. What we've been saying and what state legislatures haven't been listening to is the fact that this kind of fraud is very rare. So I think we created a place that people can actually go and see, in a cohesive, comprehensive manner that it is truly rare. And the other thing was the mail-in ballot and absentee ballot fraud being the most common type of fraud that we found. And election experts that I spoke to on, ones that work for left-leaning organizations and ones for right-leaning organizations, because think tanks can kind of lean one way or the other sometimes. They all pretty much agree that the opportunity for fraud is present in absentee ballot more than any other type. So, the question that somebody reading an article must ask is, why, essentially, is the country and many, many states either trying or passing laws that solve the issue of people impersonating people at the polls, when that essentially is not a problem. But we do have this problem, this opportunity for fraud in mail-in ballots, but there's been very little regulation passed.
Thank you. If you can now put us back up on the big screen, Kara Prasad will talk here about a poll that the Washington Post conducted at our request, conducted a poll for News21 and the Washington Post about people's attitudes towards voter ID and election fraud.
Hi everybody. So basically it started off with the original idea for the story was to talk about voter ID and look at just what Natasha discussed, but it would be a lot of overlap and the story was done before. So what we wanted to do was take a look at what do people really know about these laws. In between 2000 and 2012, there were about 62 bills that were passed around 37 states. So we took the Washington Post poll, and what we found was there was widespread support, but people really didn't know the implications of what these laws would be. So percentage-wise, I think, I have it written down, it's like 74% strongly agreed or somewhat agreed, but 51% hadn't even heard about these laws or what they really meant. So we thought that was significant, and we continued looking at the numbers, and the more experts we spoke to, they looked at the wording of these questions. The way it was worded would determine how people would answer it. So a question that's worded, so would you support these laws to deter voter fraud? Well, yeah, voter fraud is a bad thing. So you find people, if it's worded that way, they would answer in that way. And then as we went along and spoke to more experts, the poll showed a partisan divide, a racial divide. Republicans supported moves for voter fraud, voter ID laws to prevent fraud, while Democrats looked at it from a disenfranchisement point of view, like minorities are going to be affected by this. So in the end, that was what one of our main stories was about, looking at what do people really know about voter ID laws and if it would make a difference.
Good, thank you. Now, tomorrow night when people vote, there may be, tomorrow all day long while people vote, there may be disagreements over how some of these laws are interpreted. In the state of Pennsylvania, for example, the court said voter ID will not go into effect for this election, but the state said, well, yeah, okay, that's fine, but we're still going to ask people to bring their photo ID if they can so they can get in practice for doing it. So is that going to create confusion among voters or not? In Ohio, there's a question of people who have not returned their absentee ballots. If they come to vote in person because they decided to vote in person instead of by absentee ballot, they're going to be given provisional ballots to vote that will be counted later than the regular votes would be counted. There are a lot of possibilities in many states around the country for controversies over how the vote is administered during the day. In the majority of the states, the person who makes these decisions is the Secretary of State for each state in the Union. And during our reporting, Joe Henke discovered that increasing numbers of these Secretaries of State are politicized. And the question then is raised about whether or not they're going to conduct this election fairly. So Joe will talk about that.
Yeah, so I, along with my reporting partner, Emily Norris, who's one of the 3 fellows from Nebraska involved with News21 this summer, we looked at 36 Secretary of States. There's only 36 that oversee the elections in their given state. In other states, there'll be nonpartisan boards or other entities that oversee the elections. But in that group of 36, there was a select group that we saw that were involved in what you could call activist or partisan activities that involved endorsing candidates when they ran for office. They might have been financially backed by strongly partisan organizations. Some of them, even though they're in a role that is traditionally nonpartisan, they would continue to speak at either Republican or Democratic events and advocate strongly for individuals that would be appearing on, say, a ballot tomorrow night that they need to administer. And it's an interesting role because they never count a single vote usually unless there's a recount and then they get involved sometimes at that point. But they set all the ground rules within their given state for how the election is going to be administered. They're the supervisor for all the county or city election workers that report directly to them, and those are the people that do count the votes. So we were trying to see sort of what this partisan activity by secretaries could have influenced elections. And a lot of people are familiar with the 2000 election with Katherine Harris, and she was the Secretary of State in Florida. That's where they started to get a lot of I guess, mainstream media attention. And since then, it's been very quiet, but now we're starting to see a group. They're starting to bring attention back to the role when it comes to elections. So we focused mainly on Kansas's Secretary of State, Chris Kobach, and he was involved in other partisan activities. He wrote Arizona's SB 1070. He was one of the main writers behind that. So they're doing things even beyond elections that are very partisan. We also mentioned Scott Gessler in Colorado quite a bit. And he could have a role tomorrow night. He's in a battleground state. John Husted in Ohio, Ken Dentzner in Florida. They're in battleground states as well. Ohio's been very publicized. Ken Dentzner is involved there in what people are calling partisan activity by trying to clean voter rolls, especially in areas that there's a lot of Latino or minority voters, and they're saying that he's going to possibly disenfranchise people with what he wants to do to clean the voter rolls there, but a lot of that is questionable and partisan. You can't really draw any strong conclusions there, but towards the end of our research and our story, we looked at, well, what are the alternatives? And one that we found that a lot of people say is maybe the best option is Wisconsin. They have what's called, I believe it's the GAB, the Government Accountability Board. And that's a series of retired judges, people that voters can look to and say, these are the most nonpartisan people possibly in our society. So they have, I believe it's 6 or 7 judges, and they're the ones that oversee their elections, which is a very strong contrast when you look at one individual, Secretary of State, it's either a Democrat or a Republican overseeing the election. In Wisconsin, that's a system that they're very comfortable with, and some other states we've talked to, they look to Wisconsin and sort of how can we replicate that, or is that something that we should or could move to?
So, for instance, when you watch the election counting tomorrow night, if Ohio becomes very close and it's a linchpin to who's going to win the election, you want to watch for the activities of the Secretary of State there, who may have some pretty important decisions to make about when votes will be counted, which votes will be counted, will polling places be kept open longer if there's still lines when it's time for them to close, et cetera, et cetera. He's a Republican. He's accused by Democrats of being an activist Republican in this regard, so you want to watch for that sort of thing. It's a good time to say that, I should have said at the outset, that the people who are chosen to be News 21 fellows in the summer, the 24 who did the actual work, it's like a summer internship. They're paid a stipend of $7,500 each for the summer, and there's also travel money for them. So between the seminar and the summer, our reporters went to 40 different cities in 21 different states, and Joe went to Puerto Rico because the Secretaries of State happened to be having their conference there. It was a real hardship for Joe. We were worried about him in Puerto Rico. So Joe, tell us though what you discovered there. Was anybody else covering this conference?
So there's no one else, so that was the most interesting thing. I went with Lizzie Chen. She was one of the photographers with News 21. And really, we were the only journalists there of any kind. I don't know if that was because it was in San Juan and it was away from the States. But when you went there, you could get a real sense of sort of what secretaries talk to each other. And it didn't make it into the story. You can't really draw any conclusions off it. But you would see a lot of these secretaries that we found to have very partisan roles, that maybe they were very good friends there. Maybe that's just coincidence or whatnot. You don't want to draw too many conclusions. But we were the only ones there. And at a lot of their meetings, they talked about a lot of these issues. And their national organization knows that this coverage that either that we did or that other places are doing, and it's stuff that they know doesn't look that good to voters. They don't want to have any bias involved in the voting process. So I'm surprised there isn't more media coverage on it, especially at their meeting. But it is something to keep watching. Ohio, they're going to have cases after this election. I wouldn't be surprised within the next year if they're at the Supreme Court for at least one item. One of our objectives of News 21 is to pick a subject that's timely, that's important, which obviously this was, but also to pick a subject where we know that the commercial news media can no longer cover it as thoroughly as they might have before. So we're trying to fill in the gaps of the commercial media. I mean, this is exactly one of those stories that nobody else was doing, that Joe and Liz and Jen did, that nobody else was doing. And by the way, they assure us that they spent all their time in Puerto Rico indoors, never went to the beach, and of course we believe them. The next thing to talk about is another thing to watch for tomorrow and tomorrow night is whether or not poll watchers all around the country on the two sides get involved with either hassles with voters or controversies with each other, or even wind up in court. Their activities even wind up in court during the course of the day.
And again, this is one of those stories where we pioneered the coverage. I've seen a number of stories about the poll watcher phenomenon. After our first story came out, it was in the Washington Post, among other news media. In fact, the two stories that attracted the largest, all the stories did well on NBCnews.com, but the two that attracted the most page views, well over 1 million each, was the election fraud story and our poll watcher story. And now AJ Vicens and then Natasha will talk about that story.
Hi. So poll watchers are basically people that go to the polls to watch people vote, and they watch the election workers conduct business. It's been going on for a long time, many decades, but it's starting to intensify. And one of the main groups behind this activity is a group called True the Vote. They're out of Houston, Texas. They're a Tea Party group. They formed in 2009, and then in the 2010 midterm elections, they trained a couple hundred poll watchers that went around to primarily minority areas to watch people vote. And they were accused of harassing people and being a little overzealous in what they were doing, and it created a lot of problems, a lot of animosity. They got into it pretty bad with the new Black Panther Party, and rather than kind of backing down and reassessing what they were doing, they doubled down and increased what they were doing. And this one Tea Party group, among the hundreds nationwide, caught on, and their model spread to more than 30 states. And so Natasha and I went to Houston to their annual summit to kind of hang out with them. It was like a Tea Party Woodstock sort of deal. A lot of big stars on the political right were there, and a lot of voter ID proponents. And then we went to Wisconsin for the recall election of Scott Walker and watched them work there. And so in response, a lot of groups on the left, the Obama campaign, are training their own poll watchers and their own lawyers and their own volunteers to go out and kind of counter the True the Vote and the conservative poll watchers. And so you have legions of people watching each other, watching people vote, watching how voting happens. And I was doing a follow-up the other day with Natasha, and we talked to an election expert who said that, sure, this has happened in the past, but this year could be the biggest and the biggest scope for this sort of thing in ever if they actually show up. And the potential is that, they show up in such numbers and act so aggressively that it hampers the vote in particular areas, and it intimidates people from voting. It causes fights, it causes arguments, and it's just, one of the most offensive things that kind of the critics say is that they always end up in minority areas. And so we asked Catherine Engelbrecht, the woman who founded this group, why that is, and she said that's where the fraud is, essentially. So it's a highly charged topic. I hope I'm not missing anything. I'll pass it to Natasha.
Yeah, the extent of this group, we've been trying to figure out how influential they might be tomorrow, because there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of rumors, there's a lot of, people are kind of scared about what might happen. And essentially, what might happen is, what they do is they train people to, not to submit voter challenges, but how to submit voter challenges if they find, a voter isn't who they say they are, or if they see anything that they think is wrong in the polls. And that could have a disrupting effect when you have groups that, they really think election fraud happens a lot. And if they start submitting voter challenges and questioning voters' right to vote on a large scale, then that could present serious problems at the polls, particularly in places like Ohio and Wisconsin. Ohio, if it comes down to a very close vote, and there are a lot of voter challenges, and these groups are submitting challenges, it could really throw a wrench in the process. And the groups on the left, they're prepared for same-day litigation. So we could see some fights go down. We could see some things go to court lots of lawyers bickering with each other tomorrow. We just don't know exactly to the extent of what that would happen, but it does have the potential to disrupt the process. And yeah, so we'll see. We've been trying to figure out what's going to happen.
And AJ and Natasha will be watching that tomorrow, and if there's a story to do, they will do it. And the Washington Post has a team of reporters ready to for voter irregularities wherever they occur around the country. And if it involves the poll watchers, we'll be using reporting from Natasha and AJ tomorrow. I should say that last night on ABC National News, there was about a 3 or 4 minute segment on True the Vote, this Tea Party group that started this poll watching, and there wasn't a single fact in it that wasn't already in AJ's and Natasha's story months ago. They really blazed the trail on that particular subject. Did that work? Another thing we discovered during the project was that the whole issue of voter ID affected disproportionately college students. Those college students who, rather than vote by absentee ballot where they live the rest of the year, or going back home to vote on election day, which can be difficult to do because you're in school or wherever you are on election day. And so they want to vote in the state where they're attending school. And there was a whole question as to whether or not they were going to be disenfranchised by various permutations of these voter ID laws. And Jack Fitzpatrick looked into that, and he'll tell us what he found.
Yeah, the whole issue, is this working? Can people hear me? Okay, good. The whole issue of how this trend of voter ID laws coming into place affects students, college students, was a really interesting one to look into, because half of the issues that college students face already existed and have existed for decades, and then half of them are directly related to all these voter ID laws that you see in a lot of different states across the country. Some of the issues, well, one of the big issues that affects a lot of college students is if you're an out-of-state college student deciding where to vote. You can choose to vote where you go to college if you meet certain requirements. Really, in most states, the only requirement is living there for 30 days. So if you're a college student, even if you're a freshman, you could technically choose to vote there depending on what kind of ID you have and that kind of thing. But there have actually, within this wave of voter ID laws, there's been sort of a miniature wave of laws related to college students deciding where to vote. So, for example, in New Hampshire, there was a bill introduced that would have made it illegal for a college student to vote in New Hampshire unless that college student had already lived in New Hampshire before going to college. Ignoring all the details of how that would be enforced, like, for example, what if your family actually moved to New Hampshire and you transferred to the University of New Hampshire, that would have affected a lot of probably Democratic voters, just like you saw with all these other issues of, these voter ID laws affecting minorities and the elderly. This is just sort of one more wave of things that opponents of voter ID laws and similar voting laws that have come up recently, that opponents of these laws say affects Democrats much more than they affect Republicans, because college students, especially in the 2008 election, came out in very big numbers. I believe 18 to 24-year-olds were the only age group to significantly increase their turnout in the 2008 election. About 2/3 of 18 to 24-year-olds supported Obama in 2008, and now you see some laws coming into place that are voter ID laws and some separate laws that would make it a little bit more difficult for college students to vote. So there's that issue of deciding where to vote and what state you're going to vote in, and deciding to actually go to the polls or going through the process of getting an absentee ballot, which is just a lot more bureaucracy. If anybody here has used an absentee ballot, it's pretty complicated in some states and counties. The other issue that I found was that a lot of the voter ID laws, just a general law that says you have to show this ID at the poll if you're going to be able to vote, don't include student IDs, or do include some student IDs but not others. So, for example, when Georgia's voter ID law, that has been looked at by conservatives as a very successful law, especially because minority turnout actually increased after it went into place. It's kind of an influential voter ID law. This one said in the bill that a government-issued ID other than a driver's license would count. And that technically means that if you go to a public university, you can use your student private university, you can't. And that means 6 out of the 9 historically black colleges and universities in the state, their IDs do not count. And all 4 of the women's colleges in the United States, right, in the state, their IDs also don't count. So, of course, the critics of this law are looking at that and saying, even within the demographic of college students, you're sort of singling out minorities and women who, as we've seen as sort of trend in the opposition to these voter ID laws, are likely to vote for Democrats more than Republicans. There's actually a bill in Georgia that would have evened it out between public and private schools and said, if it's an accredited school, you can use that. A state representative there tried to get it passed 3 times, and it failed every time, and all she could say that she heard from opponents were basically that she was a Democrat trying to get this passed, and she's in a Republican-controlled House. So it was very interesting to look into some of these issues affecting college students, how it would affect the college students on election day, and what they would need to show to actually be able to vote. And also, just the fact that this is sort of one more thread in this issue of which voters is it going to affect. For you guys, Arizona was not a particularly controversial state in terms of student IDs, but it still has its own sort of technicalities. For example, you guys could use your SUM cards because it's a voter ID in Arizona, but because it doesn't include your address, you would also need to bring something like a utility bill. So there are all these issues that, if you have a driver's license, you can go and use that and vote and you're done. If you use a college ID, depending where you are, you might not be able to use it all. In Arizona, you would have to bring something else, and this is creating sort of another wave of controversy in, how it's going to affect the election, and basically who's going to be able to vote.
Thanks. 3 points to make at this stage. One is you've heard a lot about the polarization of this issue, how the 2 parties disagree entirely about what they see is going on here. I want to make clear that we began this project with a completely open mind. We had speakers from both the right and the left. We had the leader of the movement to try to do something about election fraud. Hans von Spasskovsky of the Heritage Foundation spoke to our class. He was profiled in the most recent issue of the New Yorker magazine, if you want to read more about him. We had the Republican National Lawyers Association speak to our class. We had the Secretary of State of Georgia, which Jack just made reference to, speak to our class, in addition to people on the other side of the argument, from civil rights groups and others, and then people that are regarded by and large as neutral experts on elections and voting rights. So we want a completely open mind and then see where the facts led us. Second point to make is that you've also heard from all these speakers, and you'll hear now shortly from Mary Ann Battle about it in another context, how many differences there are from state to state, and indeed in some states from county to county. There is no national election system in the United States. A lot of other countries are amazed by the fact that we do not have a national voting registration. We do not have uniform national laws about voting, as is the case in most European countries. Instead, it differs wildly from state to state, and even within states, from year to year, depending upon who's governor and who controls the state legislature, they'll change procedures all the time, which is one of the things that we spent a lot of time looking at in this project. And one of those things that differs the most from states to states are the rights of felons to vote after they've served their sentences, to pay their debt to society, as the saying goes. Can you then regain the right to vote? And Mary Ann Battle and a group of reporters looked into that. Mary Ann?
Hi, everybody. I will admit that I was largely ignorant on the topic when I entered the seminar, and I thought, oh, this will be easy. I'll just read up on this. And as Len pointed out, there are 50 different laws, and they're, I wouldn't say constantly in flux, but they can change pretty rapidly depending on the system. I worked with a rather large team within the News21 group, and during the seminar we did a lot of the front-end research, and then it was up to us to find the people behind the stories. There are an estimated 5.8 million people that are disenfranchised or unable to vote because of various felon voting laws. Like we said before, every state is different. So in Maine and Vermont, for example, if you're convicted of a felony and you go to prison, you can vote from prison. You never lose your right to vote. But then there are more, I guess, extreme examples in Florida, for example, where you have to petition the governor and the board, and you have to fill out an application, you have to pay restitution, and the entire process could leave you without the right to vote for 20 years. What was interesting is the amount of people we were able to find in a short period of time. There are lots of civil rights groups and other organizations that are trying to change various laws across the country. And the stories were really powerful. They impacted me a lot, and we were able to do all sorts of things with the information we got. We had 2 print pieces, one specifically on Florida because it's such an interesting case, one at a national level. We had a photo gallery that included excerpts, audio excerpts from the interviews that we had with people. We also had a great NPR piece that just aired recently about Florida again. It was popular. And throughout the entire process, it was just a very humbling experience to get to carry these stories out to the larger population and to share these with people who probably, like myself, had no idea. I mean, I'm a Florida native and I had no idea that Florida's law was the way that it was. I think that what's good to keep in mind is that this isn't one of the ones that was able to be split into the conservative, liberal spectrum. This varies according to morality, according to experience, according to political thought about what it means to be able to cast a ballot. Some people think that once you commit a felony, you've broken a contract with society and you should never be allowed to vote again. Other people think that if you are convicted of a serious crime and you go back out into society and you are unable to vote, it sends the wrong message and it allows people to feel like they're ostracized and outcasted, and therefore they may become more likely to go back to prison, which is costly in I guess the government sense.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a very interesting topic, and I was very fortunate to get to work with a bunch of people on it, and it was very rewarding.
Do you remember the anecdote about the couple where, yeah, that's a really good example of how arbitrary this is.
Yeah, so writing the lead was really difficult because we didn't know if we wanted to go with hard news or if we wanted to start with a story. And kind of at the last minute, I came across this couple from Arizona, which was great because they were right there at my disposal. And their story was they both struggled with drug addiction. They met in rehab, but Katie Vanderkamp, who was his wife, she was never convicted of a felony during her time, struggling with drug addiction. But her husband, Josh Vanderkamp, was, and he wasn't just convicted of one felony, he was convicted of 2, which in Arizona means that you can't vote unless you are restored. And so he can't vote, but she can, and they have very similar backgrounds. And they both they clawed their way through addiction and now have a house, they're homeowners, they have 2 kids. Josh has a stable job, Katie's working toward getting a master's degree in counseling. And they've got their act together, but this one thing basically makes Josh feel like he can never let go of his past. So it was just a very interesting and somewhat emotional experience to be able to interview them in their home, and they did feature prominently in the story, and I have heard from them throughout the time.
Good. It really humanized the story. Yeah. Lastly, multimedia plays an important part of this project. Every year we try to do more and more imaginative, innovative, and effective multimedia to present some things that don't grab the reader as much in print as they might through photography or video interviews or innovative graphics and so on. We want to particularly put up on our website and offer to our various publication partners. Brandon was in charge of that aspect of it this year. Last year in the Food Safety Project, he was one of the reporters and photographers, so he has a good grasp of the multimedia, and he'll tell you about that now.
Good evening, everyone. You guys hear me okay? Great. So I was in charge of really trying to bring these stories of people that all News 21 fellows did beyond the written word, beyond books, to show them through video, through photos, interactives, you name it. So I helped the fellows kind of formulate those ideas and execute them on this News 21 site. But beyond photos and beyond video and beyond interactives, there's some really cool, unique designs that we brought to this website to make the user experience a better experience. One of those is, I don't know if any of you have heard of responsive design. This website is built in such a way that whether it's your iPhone or whether it's your iPad, this site automatically resizes to fit whatever device you're using to view it, which is a really cool thing, and it's a new trend kind of in the web design user interface world. I'll show you a few of the cooler things that we did, and Marianne mentioned one of the photo galleries of felons across the U.S. So with this story, a photographer traveled throughout the country to meet some of these felons that had either regained the right to vote or were still disenfranchised. And instead of just doing a photo gallery, what we did was we combined the photo gallery with audio snippets. So we have a 30-second interview with each felon with photos. So it's beyond, kind of a flat one-dimensional interaction. It goes to the point where you could hear and see the people talking. And I'll show you, this is the Vanderkamps that Marianne just mentioned, and the people from Arizona. And then I'll show you a different one. This is the slideshow gallery with audio. So every time you click, you can click this play button. Chris, will that go through? Yeah?
How can you say you want to help us be a part, readjust back to society, especially if you've done a long period of time? But you put us out there, then you don't want us to talk. You don't want to hear from us anymore. As you can see, I'm very outspoken. I'm very outspoken. I always wanted to voice my opinion, and I still do today, whether anybody hears it or not. But,
so, you get a sense of the personality of this individual. So it's not just something you're reading in a story. It's somebody that you can see and you can hear, which adds a dimension of storytelling, and it interacts with the reader in a different kind of way. And there's a whole series of these. I encourage you guys to go and check out the site. Each of these has audio and photos with it. And it's a great opportunity and way to get deeper into the story itself. Some of the others included interactives. We clicked a few times on the fraud database gallery that Corbin talked about. And that was really neat because you can go through and explore the data yourself. As Corbin mentioned, the database, all the documents, all 5,000, right? About 5,000 documents that were with this project are all in Document Cloud. So you can go through and read through each of those documents if you wanted to. Or you could come in here and you could go by state or by year and filter the reported cases of election fraud. So when I say a deeper and better user experience, it's beyond photos, beyond video, it's interactions, usability, and really allowing the user to come into the website and learn as much as they want. Another one with, I'll show you another photo slideshow gallery. This is from, here's one of the videos. And I'll play a quick snippet from, I'll show you this photo gallery first. This is one, KP Cara shot some of these photos from Alabama. And it shows, a cool story of this little registration drive on the side of the street. And again, it just brings you deeper into that these are real people that these stories talk about that could be potentially disenfranchised. It's not just this abstract idea or thought. It's real people that are being impacted. So that was really cool.
Very exciting that you're showing your photographs.
Good. Yeah. So, and as Len mentioned, all the fellows traveled to 40 cities across 21 states and 1 U.S. territory. You guys working in newsrooms as you leave the Cronkite School, not many people have that opportunity to travel that extensively. Especially for one newsroom to have 24 fellows working on one single project for 10 weeks at a time, it's pretty unprecedented. And I can't think of a newsroom out there today that would put that many resources into one project alone.
And at the same time, I want to point out that as wonderful resources as we had, it was hard work. Which was an awful lot that was accomplished between January and August, because we wanted to publish before the two political conventions. And as you saw, most of the student journalists did reporting, writing, photography, video, work on multimedia projects, and the database work. It was an amazing accomplishment. And we're always interested in people who want to work that hard at that sophisticated level in future News 21 projects. I'll say a quick word about the election, and we got time for some questions. Tomorrow night, I will be in the Washington Post newsroom. Even though I'm retired, they brought me back. I don't think anybody else wants to do this. I'll be in charge of the decision desk, where we will be deciding who's won each state, and therefore who's won the presidency and who's won control of the United States Senate. I'll be working with our polling unit, which will be using exit polls and other information to help us make these decisions. There will be 6 student volunteers working with us, including 2 from the Cronkite School, Washington Bureau, Matthew Standifer and Tara Prasad, who will be monitoring social media and commercial media, and also calling around the states to pick up any information that's not already on the wire services or on television. We will have Washington Post reporters in each of the most hotly contested states. And out of all that information, we will try to decide as quickly but as carefully as possible who's won each state. So, questions for any of the reporters about any of the things they talked about, questions for me about the election generally, we've got time to do that. And Brandon can identify the questioners, and please use the microphone to state your question.
Somebody's got a question.
So earlier this semester, Cronkite News Series published a story on how voters are looking to vote online via smartphone. How do you see sort of some of these voting issues coming into the digital age in the next few decades?
I think AJ is a good person to answer that, in part because he's got a great conspiracy theory.
Thank you, Len. I pitched a story about voting machines being hacked, and Len laughed at me, but he was kind about letting me pursue it. We turned it into an interactive where we chronicled all the machines and all the technology in every voting jurisdiction in the country. But to answer your question, the experts that I talked to thought that voting through your phone, voting through your iPad, voting through email might be the stupidest idea ever. It is so easy to manipulate that and so insecure that it would just be, we already have so many problems with the voting system as it is, as Corbin and Natasha, documented so well. It's just not a great idea at all. It's so vulnerable to attack and such a right target for domestic people, for foreign actors, if you will, and even just for ineptitude. I mean, one little error in a code, anyone out there that does coding can trip everything up. So we are nowhere near being able to do that on a safe level.
Also, with current technology, of course, would eliminate the secret ballot, because people can monitor everything that you do on your iPhone and your iPad, and in fact are doing it all the time, and so they would know who you're voting for. Another question?
Thank you. Love what you're doing. It's the humanitarian effort's really impressive to me. I do have kind of a question that's been nagging me for a while, though. Maybe you have an answer for it. I saw a video service last spring of a young man in Washington, D.C. walking into a polling place, and despite being a 20-something-year-old white kid, he asked for Eric Holder's ballot. Eric Holder is our 61-year-old African-American Attorney General, and they offered him his ballot, and not wanting to commit a felony on tape, he didn't take it, but it clearly looked like he could have. I'm curious, since it looks like voter fraud is so easy to accomplish, through that video, what would be your response to that?
I'll talk about that because I live in the District of Columbia. First of all, that of course was a sting, an organized sting by a conservative group. And we don't know if he would have been able to actually cast that vote in the end or not, because I know before I could cast my vote on Friday, I had to go through certain checks and balances both to get my ballot and to vote. So I don't know how that person was able to accomplish that when I couldn't accomplish it at my voting place, for instance, if I wanted to on Friday. I would be surprised if that was widespread. It's rather difficult in most states to be able to impersonate somebody else. And indeed, only 10 people, as we discovered, since the year 2000 have been prosecuted for doing so.
Particularly for Len, could you speak to your kind of the worst case scenario tomorrow? What are the things you're most dreading?
Yeah, well, there's already been a lot of confusion about voting in Florida, and that could only increase tomorrow. And if there's no clear winner in Florida right from the beginning, that could lead to a long night. Even more importantly, in Ohio, which really does look like the key state for one or the other's election, there could be other problems there because, as I said earlier, they send out a huge number of absentee ballots, and something like 300,000 have not been, I think I have that number right, or maybe I think I have that number right, were not returned. Now that does not mean that those people are going to try to vote in person. Maybe they're just not going to vote. But if they try to vote in person, in order to make sure they're not double voting, they will have to sign a provisional ballot, vote on a provisional ballot, in order for the state to have time to check that provisional ballot against any absentee ballots in the same person's name to eliminate voting fraud, which makes sense. But the Secretary of State has said he's not going to start doing that until November 17th. And so if you're within the margin of a recount in Ohio, with a lot of those ballots outstanding, it could well be the end of November before we know who wins in Ohio. The other possibility for a nightmare scenario is that in some of these voter ID states where the election's contested, or in Pennsylvania where the judge said voter ID has to be delayed, it can't be used in this election, but in which the Secretary of State has said, well, yeah, that's okay, but we'll still ask people for voter ID. They don't have to give it to us, but we want to try it out. If that begins to cause a lot of problems where the two sides are bickering over whether or not voters are being harassed and they go to court, or if there are places where there aren't enough polling places. One of the stories we've not talked about tonight that we did was that the budget cuts in many states around the union, understandable budget cuts, have reduced the number of polling places and reduced the number of election workers. And even though a lot of people voted early this year, more than ever before, there could still be very, very long lines in some places, and how those long lines of voters are handled. The ballot in Florida is a huge, long ballot that takes people a very, very long time, with lots and lots of, there are 19 people running for president in Florida, including Roseanne Barr, for reasons that aren't quite clear to me. So it could be that it takes so long to vote in Florida that that'll again land long lines in polling places. So there are a lot of potential nightmare scenarios. I've been supervising the election coverage of the Washington Post since 1984 as either the national editor of the paper, the managing editor of the paper, the executive editor of the paper. And only 2000 is the only year where we really had the kinds of problems that could occur again this year. I'm hoping not.
This one's for you, Corbin. I might have asked this before, so I'm sorry if I have. Were people doubting not the analysis of the numbers in your database, but the veracity of the numbers that you were drawing from? And if so, how? And also hi to everybody in D.C.
So wait, you're asking, can you...
Yeah, sorry. Not so much the analysis of the numbers that you had, but more the numbers themselves that you were drawing from. Did you come into any controversy over that? How you got them, the comprehensiveness of them, etc.
Yeah, well, are you asking, like, did people think they were not legitimate numbers, or?
Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, since August when this was published, I've been interviewed by a bunch of different radio stations and television stations across the country. And it's been really interesting as different political leanings try to pull me into saying anything more than what I keep saying, is that all we wanted to do was add hard data to everyone else's argument. But one of the interesting things that, you know, our website offers a place for comments, and we get quite a few comments, and every once in a while, our Dean Gilder here will forward it to me, and I'll go run to Steve Doig, because you know, he knows way more about this stuff than I do. But one of the questions that comes up a lot is, what about the fraud we don't catch, or that you know, election officials? Basically, how can you disprove the negative? I mean, what about all the people that didn't get caught? That's a big one. And you know, I guess, you know, obviously we live in a very partisan country, and you know, election officials across the country are presumably both Republican and Democrat, even in, you know, whatever county you're considering. And we literally begged for every case of voter fraud. I mean, begged. There was at one point our entire group stayed here having a pizza party, counting all the documents that we had gone through. And it stands to reason, over 8 months, not begged like in a day, it stands to reason that if there was any way that there was more out there, it would have been turned in either by a Republican person who's trying to prove it or whatever. In addition to that, we didn't just take convictions, we took any kind of credible mention. So if it was, even if the case didn't get a conviction, we put it in there. We erred on the side of inclusion in an effort to make sure that, you know, as many naysayers wouldn't have an opportunity to doubt the data as possible. But still, you know, people came in. One of the other things, and I'll stop the answer, but one of the other things that someone had asked us, one of our stats was, over the course of 146 million registered voters, that, you know, the 10 cases represents 1 in 10 voters, or excuse me, 1 in 15 million votes cast. And someone said, well, there's got to be, you know, almost 1 billion votes that have been cast in the 12 years that you guys did the study. So you would think that that number would be, you know, astronomically higher. And, you know, that one got me. But when I sat down and thought about it, and after talking to Steve, the issue was that the number that we could justify was, you know, counting registered voters in one period of time. So yes, we purposely, even that number is smaller because we could. The point of this long answer is there was all kinds of naysayers, but the thing that I don't get is, hey, here's this just in, we found out your data is wrong. And that's because the data's there and it was done correctly, you know what I'm saying, and that sort of thing. So I don't know if that answered your question. But
This is also still an open database. That is to say, anybody can come forward with anything that we missed, we will look into and we'll add to the database. And in fact, we have looked into various things that people have offered to us. And some of them simply don't hold water. But if there are more examples, we will put them in the database. This database is not finished.
And I'll add one more thing to that. On the webpage where the fraud story is located, there's an entire section on the methodology that was used to not only define the different types of election fraud, but how the entire database was built. And it includes, you know, that there were more than 2,000 public records requests around the country for this database. So the whole method, if people have questions, they can see exactly how all of this was compiled.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Good luck tomorrow.